I'm going to start off with Dr. Len Ochs with a unique new system that he's developed that combines brainwave EEG biofeedback with light and sound stimulation. Dr. Ochs received his PhD in social psychology from the State University of New York, Albany in 1973. Although specializing in school and clinical psychology, Dr. Ochs is also an inventor and has received the award for instrumentation from the Association of Psychophysiology and Biofeedback, the premier organization in the field. Recent interests include the treatment of epilepsy, closed head injury, post-traumatic stress, depression, addictions, and attention deficit disorder with the use of EEG and electroencephalographic entrainment feedback, he calls this process, or EEF for short. His practice is in Concord, California. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Len Ochs.
I'm Len Ochs, and I'm going to be talking about integrating photic and auditory stimulation with EEG monitoring. And when that is done, the lights and the sounds that you're used to when working with any of these sound and light stimulation devices becomes actually a biofeedback display for the person. However, it's very different from the biofeedback that's typically done from this standpoint. When a person hears or sees a biofeedback signal, that information is interpreted by the person intellectually. And that person has to try to figure out the relationship between what he or she sees and hears and what it means to the person. So let's take muscle tension, for instance. If we're dealing with muscle tension and the tone goes up in pitch, the person has to say, the tone is going up in pitch. I wonder what that means. Am I tenser or am I looser? And as the person figures that out, or some people use a conditioning model, as the person becomes conditioned to the meaning of the tone or the signal, the person begins to be able to voluntarily change the signal by changing their body status, whether it's changing muscle tension or changing skin temperature or skin moisture, or even brain waves. So there's quite a bit of work on brain waves done presently. Brainwave biofeedback that has been showing through double-blind controlled studies to be effective with addictions and post-traumatic stress. Generally, the protocol is with inpatients being seen twice a day for about a half hour to 45 minutes at a time, and 15 days later, total of 30 sessions, plus some preparatory work, preliminary temperature training. The people have been free from relapse for about 3 years. Now, this is about 250 subjects. The work was done by Eugene Peniston at the Fort Lyons VA Hospital, Fort Lyons, Colorado. Gene is now at the Bonham Medical Center in Texas, where he's in charge of a unit, and they're gradually pushing him upward, possibly to keep him from doing more research. So he's getting more and more administrative tasks put on his shoulders. There's another kind of application for brainwave biofeedback, and that is attention deficit disorders. And Joel Lubar at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, is one of the leaders in this field. And his numbers are not tremendous, but they've been reliable. And children with attention deficit disorders with and without hyperactivity are beginning to get off Ritalin. And this work is quite old now. This is not revolutionary work. There's a third application for brainwave biofeedback, and that is in the area of epilepsy and the reduction of seizures. So that's basically what is going on in the biofeedback field that predates the work that I've done. Then on the other hand, we have the work with photic stimulation, and auditory stimulation. Two fellows with the name of Harold Russell and John Carter in Galveston several years ago used auditory and photic stimulation working with children who have big splits between verbal and performance intelligence quotients. And after about 6 to 8 weeks, these kids are functioning better. Their IQs are no longer split. There's more of a parity between their verbal and nonverbal scores. Their behavior's improved. And Dr. Russell, whom I've known for about 15 years, asked me one day, knowing that I have a penchant for designing equipment, asked me whether I would design a system that he could basically plug into a cassette recorder where a therapist could make a tape in the office for a child using some of the heavy-duty clinical instrumentation that he has. And on this tape would be the information which would guide the lights and sounds for the child. So this could be taken home and used. And basically the gimcrack that he asked me to design was a thing you could plug into the cassette recorder, which would translate the information on the tape to information that would be inside the flashing lights for goggles or sounds. And in my typical adolescent negative frame of mind, I said, no, I'm not going to do that. That tape may be relevant to the kid in the office at the time, but I don't know how relevant it would be for the child when the child gets home. The child may be in a different state of consciousness, and I don't know about the relevance of the tape. But what I said was, I will design a system for you, if you like, that would use the kid's own brain waves to set the frequency of the strobing, to set the frequency of the sounds. We'll make it use binaural tones. And this way, as the kids change, brain waves change on a moment-to-moment basis, the feedback that the child will be getting will be absolutely custom-tailored to him or her at that moment. So he said, go ahead. And this is probably about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And since that time, I've been working with Bill Stewart, who works out of his place in Bainbridge Island, Stewart Enterprises. Bill, you want to raise your hand? Bill has put together some software that allows you to hook up various kinds of manufacturers' equipment, whether it be biofeedback equipment of different kinds or CD players, Laserdisc players, and you can hook almost in a kind of a modular fashion one piece of equipment up with one other device. So we took Robert Austin's Synergizer board, which fits inside of a personal computer, and Bill wedded his, using his software, wedded the Synergizer board for the courier with a biofeedback system called the J&J i330. And Jan Hoover actually lives on and works on Bainbridge Island also, probably one of the largest makers of biofeedback equipment in the country. So the BOSS software, biomedical operating system, joins the Synergizer card on one hand, which produces the lights and the sounds, and the brainwave biofeedback system on the other, making the lights and sound strobing stimulation a different kind of a biofeedback display. So probably about 6, 7, 8 months ago, Bill started getting me the preliminary software, and in order to see what this animal was, I used the software in my practice in the Bay Area. And it's been downhill ever since. People got better very rapidly. They left. I've been depressed. My first person was someone who had 200 hours of brainwave biofeedback system a la Eugene Peniston, using some very, very high-class equipment. And he's a Vietnam vet, had been having temper rages for 2 weeks at a time throughout his entire life. He was addicted to cocaine and alcoholic, primarily as a result of his time in the service. I guess it's a reward for good service. He'd had a head injury when he was a little kid. A car hit him. And in 15 half-hour sessions, he did improve a little bit with the brainwave biofeedback. His temper was a little bit better, but his wife was still going to leave him. But in 15 half-hour sessions, this gentleman no longer doesn't have any temper tantrums anymore, but he has a 16-year-old kid who can no longer drive him off the wall. And the disorientation that the child went through was really interesting, because he would do things to deliberately provoke his father, and he was bewildered that his father did not respond. Anything that would, any kind of stress that happened, whether it was wheeling his wife around from one hospital to the other when she hurt herself, or difficulties with the emergency room procedures and the stalls and the mix-ups there, or any variety of a number of other kinds of problems, would set him off. And gradually, over the period of 15 sessions, that this disappeared. Another person, a high-level corporate executive who was in charge of human resources in a major chain store, came in, and she said, she was referred by her employee assistance program. And she said, all of a sudden, I am no longer able to get out of bed and go to work. Well, what's happening? Well, she said, work has been getting scary lately. Some of the people that I fired told me that that my life was at risk, and then the lives of my family were at risk. And I'm just afraid to go to work. It's totally unprotected there, and the company cannot do anything to help me out. I work in an unprotected office up on the second floor of the building. Anybody can get there at any time. So she's quite depressed. So I did a little bit of psychotherapy. I think I'm a wonderful psychotherapist, and she just didn't get it. She was resistant, right? I said, how about biofeedback? She said, I've done biofeedback in all my human resources training. And she went on vacation. She says, maybe that'll help. And she came back from vacation. She said, I had a terrible vacation. I couldn't forget about work. I'm very depressed. I need something, some kind of relief. And of course, I don't want to go on medication. So I said, well, I've got this stuff here that I can try on you. You'd be a guinea pig. You want to try it out? And she said, sure. So she hooked up, and the first thing that happens is, oh, gosh, I've got a headache coming on. All right. You know, I turn the intensity of lights down. That's better. Well, then she had a headache coming on again, backache, you know, and I trimmed the frequency of the lights. Generally, the lights can flash anywhere between 2 and 30 cycles per second, or hertz. And I found out that she just didn't like certain of the lower frequencies. Well, the lights are on a slightly longer time at the lower frequencies. So I simply truncated the span through which the lights will change, and that brought her some relief. So the next day she came in, and we started up again. Oh, here comes the headache. So I just stopped the session. I said, what do you feel? She said, I am furious. I had no idea that I am so furious. And she said, well, I'm going to leave now. So we had only about a 2-minute session. Okay? And when she came in the next day, I said, what happened? She said, well, I went home and I went to my Miata, and I took the top off it, and I floored it, and I headed for the coast. And I spent about 2 hours traveling, and I realized how angry how angry I've been at my mother for telling me that I would never be a success unless I was lost all my weight. She's a very, very heavy woman who dressed so beautifully that the appearance of heaviness was, just not there. Really a classy, classy lady. She said, I was really furious at her, and I didn't realize how furious I still am at my first husband. By the time I got home, it was gone. And from that time on, she was able to desensitize to the entire range of the frequency spectrum from 2 to 30 hertz, cycles per second. She felt better very, very rapidly. She began to admit that over the past 2 years, she'd become increasingly depressed, only she didn't know it. Of course, with all the staff cutbacks and the assumption of new responsibilities and no new staff coming on, the stress had been piling up in the background for her. She had no idea that she was this depressed. So she could only see in retrospect from the kind of relief that she felt that there was something that was really weighing very heavily on her. She began to dream intensely. She was very grateful. I got paid very rapidly from the Employee Assistance Program. And so it went. It went like that for everybody else in my practice. So I had to leave there. The psychiatrist accused me of wasting patients. Wasting patients is a medical term for referring someone in your practice a patient and they get better too soon so that you don't make adequate amounts of income from them. Okay. So I began to see the same effects with people that I saw at my home office. I've been talking with a neurochemist from Los Angeles. His name is Ken Tachiki. He was primarily interested in the work that I'd done with alcoholics using traditional brainwave biofeedback, and we kind of struck up a friendship. I went down there. He worked with a physician down there named Herbert Gross. Gross is a specialist in head injury. He gets patients from all over the world, and basically all these patients are 5 to 7 years post-head injury. All are in heavy litigation, and he and Ken Tachiki actually guide the attorneys and provide evidence for the attorneys to justify the cases. And the documentation for the cases that they provide is really superb. Herb asked me, basically as a dare, whether I would like to use some of my equipment on his patients. Now, at this point, I can readily accept that people with post-traumatic stress disorders and depression do rather well. Okay? But I thought it was the most absurd thing that I ever heard, the idea that someone with a physical injury would benefit from this. Now, I've got a reputation as a curmudgeon and a highly negative individual. And so, while I maintain this kind of a posture, I'll still go ahead and basically do things to try things out. So Herb referred me 5 patients in the first week, and 4 of them were totally better at the end of these 5 20-minute sessions. In terms of their energy levels, they no longer had to take naps. They were no longer irritable and impatient, short-tempered with their families and their coworkers. They didn't rant and rave while they were on roads traveling here and there, and that's really quite a feat in Los Angeles. The 5th one was somewhat better. Not quite back yet, but 4 out of the 5 were doing spectacularly. I was nauseous at this. If I had had no results, I could ignore it. If I had lukewarm results, I could ignore it. But this really becomes to be a pain in the neck, because this then imposes some kind of responsibility to explore what's going on, not to dismiss it, and to take it seriously enough to find out what is happening here. Whether it's we all know how warm a personality that I have, I'm sure. So we need to know how much is due to the warmth and the genuineness of my personality, which we'll call placebo for the moment, and how much is due to the gel that we use for the electrodes, how much is due to perhaps something that the people ate before coming in that just made them feel better. Perhaps it was coincidence that these 4 people just decided or happened to get better on this time. And of course, however unacceptable this was to me, I was hoping that the next 150 patients that would come in would all fail, so that I could then begin to ignore all this stuff again, and that the 4 successes were just really a chance occurrence. I started telling some of the people, physicians and researchers that I know up in Northern California, and they insisted placebo, placebo, placebo. Okay. The physician, Herb Gross, said, interesting. At the end of the week, one of the people on whom a 70-pound stereo set dropped on his head ran into Gross's office and said, basically, I'm cured. Now, this is a fellow who lost his assertiveness. He lost his spark. He's an actor. You've all seen him on TV. He was no longer able to change from one personality to another. He could no longer image himself in a part on the first reading of a script. He lost something very significant. He lost his assertiveness. He basically became a wimp when it came to negotiating with people. And his wife walked into the room on the last day of that first week and saw him harassing someone into sending him a check. And he said, my wife's jaw dropped. And she said, after we got off the phone, he said, you realize you haven't done that in 5 years. Now, some of the subtle cognitive skills don't get better in 5 20-minute sessions, okay? And when I began to see this, then I went from annoyance that it worked as well as it did to annoyance that it didn't work all the time for all circumstances. It's just I have to be negative about something. Some people are never satisfied. So this is the way it looks at this time. People who are very high functioning, who have a long-term or a brief psychological or social trauma, or people who are very high functioning and have a mechanical trauma, a head injury of some kind. There's no loss of consciousness, but that's not strictly true, because some people have lost consciousness for up to an hour and a quarter and have benefited very nicely. But they don't go into a coma. They have a concussion, so you can bleed, that's allowed. But these people are basically back to their pre-injury emotional and energy status and cognitive functioning as affected by the emotions. In other words, if they can't concentrate because of the anger and irritation that they feel, or the sadness they feel, the resentment that they feel, they can't concentrate because of the emotional reasons, that element is gone at the end of an average of 6 sessions. Now, some of the subtle cognitive stuff I'm not sure about. Harold Russell in Texas, my partner in this crime, has been using this system with people who've had strokes 5 to 7 years ago. They've long since plateaued. Okay? And that includes actually his wife. And in an average of 6 sessions, they begin to have voluntary movement. Example, one person can pick up a pencil and not snap it from the death grip. Okay? A few more sessions, another 6 sessions, she was writing with good handwriting. They begin to have voluntary movement. Begin to. These people are not going to have the same kind of hit rate that the mildly head injured or moderately head injured have. They begin to regain sensation. This is not an exercise program. These people are not doing anything. The neurologist who's been on site and the physical therapist have both documented changes. This stuff is not supposed to work according to my preconceptions with these kinds of problems. These kinds of results are, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt, extremely rare in terms of head injury rehabilitation and stroke rehabilitation. There may be someone out there here and there who can get these kinds of results, but for all practical purposes, not obtainable in most places. When I went back after the 2nd week and the results were holding, Herb Gross said, "We got something here. You don't know what it is?" And I said, "It's okay, no one else does either." I don't mind not knowing, okay? But I do know that something is happening. Now, much to my relief and disappointment at the same time, he also referred people with borderline personality disorders that he knew and had done professional work with before he began to work with head injuries, and interestingly, they were quite sensitive to the intensity of the lights. By the way, I pretty much use light stimulation with these people. It's simpler without putting the headphones on. It's one less wire, and I hate wires. They're the borderline personality disorders, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with this category, these are people who have difficulties in their relationships with others. They're filled with problems, okay? And generally, people have problems with them. They're taking things too personally. They are very sensitive people. All right? And generally, therapists have major problems dealing with these people because therapists are people too, and they find these people annoying, difficult. And it's not infrequently that you hear from therapists say, "I don't do borderlines." Okay? These people are extremely photosensitive. Most of the people who have head injuries are photosensitive too. In fact, I have to dim the lights for them in order to make them tolerable. I may have to restrict the frequency range for almost everybody and begin to desensitize them to the light. So by the end of the 1st week or beginning of the 2nd week, well, actually by the end of 3 days, the head injured patients are experiencing lights that are 200 times brighter than what I had to experience them. So I had to drop back in the intensity. By the end of that 3 days, they're full intensity lights. But the borderlines, not only did I have to have Bill Stewart modify the system so that we can put a clip on the length of the duty cycle, but I actually had to cut up my Federal Express letter packages, thin cardboard, and sandwich them inside the lights so that these people could tolerate the lights. And then they could begin to desensitize. Now, unfortunately, I get too smart too late about this, and I haven't really followed up with the borderlines. They found the experience uncertain. It was all experimental. We didn't know where we were going. They didn't get results in 5 days. So, it's something now that I'm prepared to begin to follow up on with more certainty. Now, one of the distinguishing marks two of the distinguishing marks of head injured patients is they have a lot of activity down at the very lowest regions of the brainwave spectrum. In the delta region, they have a lot of, and this is basically asleep, they have a lot of activity down there, very high amplitude. A second is they have perhaps 10 to 15 times the number of small spikes in their EEG or brainwave records. If you look at a regular classical EEG, you'll see very, very tiny spikes at certain locations. Their brains are irritable. Now, it'd be interesting, and this is a first in a long series of it would be interesting statements. It would be interesting to look at the brainwave records of people with borderline personality disorders to see whether there is any small spiking there, to see whether these people are more biologically irritable from that standpoint. It's clear that their physiology says that they're irritable. Now, it has enormous ramifications to begin to think of these people as having irritable brains and not just a socially induced or environmentally induced problem that psychotherapy and many continentals worth of psychotherapy will fix up. A lot of really careful research needs to be done in this field. There's very, very little, if any, good research with clinical populations, people who have biologically based or psychologically based problems. There are almost no controlled studies that I know of in this area. And it's a project of mine with Bill to put together some specific software that actually sets up controlled experiments so that the psychologist can design a procedure for each of several different conditions, the experimental and controlled conditions, and the psychologist, the therapist, the person running the system will not know what procedure is being followed. And we can set it up so that it's safe and begin to show, number one, that it is effective, the extent to which it's effective, and which parts of the procedure are effective. Because I have no idea, frankly, whether the desensitization to the lights and the sounds is primarily responsible for the improvement. Perhaps that in itself will do it. Perhaps it's the restriction in the range of the frequencies for stimulation and the desensitization to those frequencies that's that's responsible for their improvement. Or perhaps it's something else. And I'll tell you a little bit about exactly what it is I do, and I have a guinea pig, and we can have a short demonstration of what this is. In contrast to all the work that's being done in brainwave biofeedback at this time, I don't try to speed the brainwaves up, or I don't try to slow the brainwaves down and leave it at that, or I don't shoot for a specific target frequency. What I do is I alternately speed the brainwaves up, slow them down, speed them up, slow them down, speed them up, slow them down. Now you heard from Steve LaBerge about flexibility as an outcome. I see this as inducing a kind of flexibility. When a person is shocked, goes through trauma, the brain may secrete some chemicals to protect itself from seizures and various other ways, and various other kinds of problems. And they may not, the good news is that it probably serves some protective purpose. The bad news is it probably also interferes with their functioning. And this stuff doesn't go away like it should. And in pushing and pulling and pushing and pulling and pushing and pulling, putting no particular spin on the brain waves, because I don't know enough to say what is the proper way for a brain to be operating. I'm going to leave that to nature for the time being. I push and pull. They get better. So whether it's this pushing and pulling and the variability that I'm inducing, or whether it's the desensitization to lights or desensitization to frequencies, I don't know. We need a component analysis of that. Okay. So now I'm going to demonstrate some of the software. Do you want to come up? Then I'm going to put the brainwave electrodes on. One of the questions that I get is, well, what about seizures? I work with people who have and have had seizures. When a neurologist uses photic stimulation in a neurological exam to assess the presence and the character of seizures, that light is held on at a specific frequency for a certain length of time. Because I tag the frequency of the lights to the person's strongest brainwave frequency, and because that frequency is shifting all the time, the frequency of the lights is almost never stable. So it doesn't stay at any particular frequency. You can get seizures from being in a shopping mall, from looking at a helicopter blade, from looking at Venetian blind, but they're pretty much stable signals. This is not a stable signal. I'm not saying that that's responsible for protection from seizures, number one. I'm not saying that we can't have seizures, because theoretically it's a possibility, and sooner or later we have to be prepared for the possibility of someone having a seizure. And we have to know how the person who comes in has to know that. I'll bet you're surprised. Actually, I asked him before whether he had seizures. But it's extremely remote. So this is basically the kind of signal that's working from Richard. Is that your? Yeah, Richard's brainwaves right now, okay? And this is low frequency. Now you have two missions. One is to enjoy the light show. And the second, which is very important, and that is to tell me if anything becomes uncomfortable for you about that, and I can change things. And let me tell you what's going on the screen, especially if I can disentangle this. I've got $500,000 worth of equipment all over the place, and I have trouble disentangling the wires. What you see in the upper left is a representation of the activity. Can you folks see? Am I in the way?
Yeah.
Okay. As a representation of the activity from a fast Fourier transform of what's going on in the person's brain. On the left are the low-frequency brain waves, characteristic of drowsiness, and at the high frequency, which should be around 30 hertz or cycles per second, cognitive control, memory functions. There's a line there right underneath that called theta-beta ratio, which is a good indication of cognitive integrity. Actually, the darkness to the left is really what the ratio is, and not the light part. So the ratio is almost 3, and 3 to 1. You start getting up above that, and you find people getting increasingly flaky. When we were first doing, or very creative. Whoa! Or perhaps both. When we were first doing the brainwave training, following Gene Peniston's protocol, he only stressed alpha and theta feedback. And some of the people that I was working with were beginning to really flake out, and one drove the wrong way up a freeway entrance and lives to tell about it. Another one forgot how to get home. And we found out, he and I both found out about the same time, we really needed to change that procedure and include high-frequency brainwaves for some cognitive control. And the theta and high beta ratio is an indication of the integrity of the memory, I think. I suspect. If it gets very, very, very high or very, very low, then we've got problems. Up on top center, you see the figure called dominant frequency. That's the moment-to-moment frequency of the strongest brain wave. Now, below that, immediately below that, is something called percent lead. And basically, I am pulling his brain waves up at 5%. Now I'm going to pull the brain waves down. That 30 below that is you add 5% to the dominant frequency and you get a little bit larger number, 5% larger. What happens if we pull the brain waves lower? And I change that percent lead from 5% to minus 5%. So the lights are flashing a little bit more slowly than his strongest brain wave. 25.9, 26. See, it's bopping around. One of the problems that I see with some people is their range through which their brainwaves goes gets rather restricted. They get stuck. And they may have no low-frequency activity to speak of. They may have very little high-frequency activity to speak of. And I can begin to push them into these frequencies and out and pull them out of the frequencies. Again, kind of this variational approach, which basically allows them to begin to produce activity in the portion of the spectrum where they have not been producing activity. I can put the brightness up to 100%. See what happens here. How is that going for you? Now, most of the people who are hypersensitive cannot take lights at that brightness. Okay.
But there's much more correlation. It's become locked in now.
Yeah.
What's the maximum on the scale?
The maximum flashing is 30 hertz.
Are you using the square wave onset of your light even at low frequencies?
Yes. Okay, so if we can have the lights, and we'll free this poor victim here. Ask Richard what that was like, and I'm intimate.
Oh. Well, I was conscious of having a crowd behind me, because I've done this a lot before, and it was sort of like a real intimate experience. So having my brainwaves on screen in front of all these people was something it was hard for me to forget that. So I think that reflected a little bit on the experience I had. And it was real short, so I didn't have time to get into it.
I wanted to keep it short for a number of reasons, but primarily because it takes some getting used to. What actually did you see? What kind of patterns did you see?
Well, like I said, I've done this a lot. So in the beginning when I used to do this, I used to see lots of patterns. This time it was just like flickering lights. I didn't really get that much with patterns. I was just conscious of things changing, going deeper into a state of consciousness, but I didn't really see any patterns in this time.
Okay, thank you.
Anything happen up there? I mean, for my feedback,
Well, one of the things that Richard's asking me whether anything happened, what I saw was a lot of balance, both highs and lows, and the ability to shuttle back and forth between them. And that kind of balance is really important. There's a bias in biofeedback toward voluntary self-regulation. This does not follow that model. It's still biofeedback. The person gets information about their biological states, but this is not something that they intellectually have to participate in. Some people will fall asleep. It's really enjoy the light show kind of a thing. What it does is gets them unstuck enough so that they can participate in some kind of therapy for their own enhancement and self-regulation. Whereas before, when they tried to do that, they'd be butting their head up against the wall. The amount of blockage in terms of portions of the spectrum varies with the injury, varies with who they are and what their personality styles were beforehand. There's a tremendous amount of variation where people get blocked or frozen or locked into. So what I do is I spend a minute going up, a minute going down, a minute going up, and I cycle a minute. And once they begin to really get comfortable and I can bring the lights up to full brightness, okay, then I can begin to play. At that point, then I begin to extend the stimulation range into areas where they haven't yet gone. And generally, I keep them, I will decrease the time spent at any particular setting, say plus or minus 5% or plus or minus 50%, toward the end, because it's disruptive to change, going from positive to negative. And what I try to do is to find any kind of possible rigidity or any kind of possible lurking problem. So boosting high intensity, making rapid changes from high to low, pulling them into frequency slots where they're unfamiliar. If I can't get them upset by doing this, then they're ready to take on deep psychotherapy. I have not done any kind of comparison of this kind of procedure with a number of different problems, whether it be autism or hyperactive behavior, anything like that. I haven't taken this into the area of addictions yet. And we're sticking with closed head injury, depression, post-traumatic stress for controlled studies. And we'll branch out as the research supports us doing it. Okay? And I'm afraid I'm going to have to call that in the interest of expediency here and getting on with the show. So thank you, and I'll be available for some questions throughout the afternoon.